I would like to present first of all to you the panel, and let me start on my immediate left hand and then go to the extreme left. We start with Mrs. Irina Schoulgin. Irina Schoulgin-Nyoni is the Deputy Director General of the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the head of the Africa Department. And you also have been Ambassador of Sweden to the United Nations and Ambassador of Sweden to Mozambique, Maputo. And then we have Ambassador Baye Moctar Diop. Congratulations with the victory of Senegal yesterday. Ambassador of the Republic of Senegal to the European Union, and also former Senegalese ambassador to the African Union in Addis Ababa. So we have been in quite a few meetings, and it's really a pleasure to have you with us. And of course, I should also mention that today, at this very moment, Senegal is also chairing or president of the African Union at this very moment. So we are very happy to have you with us. And then we have Ambassador Birgitte Nygaard Markussen, quite well known in the Brussels scene by many of you, because before you moved to Addis Ababa as ambassador of the European Union and head of the EU delegation, you were also the Deputy Managing Director Africa in the European External Action Service. And you also have been heading the Africa Department in Denmark, and you were also an ambassador of Denmark in Burkina Faso, if I'm not mistaken. And then normally we should have had also a representative of the African Union Commission. They were in town because we had the commission-to-commission meeting yesterday, but most of them, of the civil servants and of the officials, including Commissioner Bankole, Commissioner for Peace and Security and Political Affairs, had to move back to Addis because of the visit of Secretary General Guterres. But we are extremely happy that we have our partner institute, ISS, the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria and in different parts of Africa, Addis Ababa, Nairobi and Dakar. That's where ISS is represented. So we have Paul Simon Handy, who is now the ISS Director for East Africa and the representative to the African Union of the Institute of Security Studies. There is another person who should have been here, and that's quite a story, but I'm not going to make it too long. We invited Oleksandr Khrebet, who is a journalist of the Kyiv Independent. And the Kyiv Independent, and I would advise you to sometimes go to their website, is a fully independent newspaper in Ukraine. It is having a small journalistic staff. And Oleksandr Khrebet has published on this particular topic. He had a paper that was dealing with the influence of Russia in Africa and how Ukraine should organize itself to also build a stronger representation in Africa. And he has particular views and perspectives on this crisis. But the problem is that we invited him. He was until 2 days ago in Kherson, and he was moving to the border with Poland. He got all the papers that allowed him to travel, but at the border, he was stopped and he couldn't leave the country. And that's very unfortunate because he really had loved to be here with us, but it was not possible. He's a young person and he had to be ready to be possibly mobilized also for this terrible war situation. But I would like to start with a video. And we have a video that we will first turn on. And this is the first element of our discussion. Let's listen to a Ukrainian voice on the current crisis context, the aggression of Russia in Ukraine, and what the implications are for Africa.
Ladies and gentlemen, honorable ambassadors, welcome to this conference organized by European Think Tank Group. My name is Oleksandr Khrebet, and I'm the reporter with the Kyiv Independent, Ukrainian media outlet. And I would like to address you a couple of questions regarding how Russia's war against Ukraine does affect African countries, the food crisis in the world, and the Ukrainian-African relations. So first of all, I would like to say that Russia is trying to blame Ukraine and make it only one responsible for the food crisis, which is affecting around 400 million people around the world, including in most vulnerable countries in Africa. But Russia doesn't say that. It's the Russian fleet who is controlling northern Black Sea, who is controlling several seaports in Ukraine, and the seaports in Ukraine is used to be the main routes to export Ukrainian agricultural products, including to Africa. And the Russian fleet mined the Black Sea, so it is hard for the sometimes for the grain caravans to have another routes than it's agreed under the UN-backed deal. Also, Ukraine doesn't have fleet because Russia drone it and they captured since 2014 a lot of vessels. But Ukraine is trying, even though, to address into the African countries, to the African people through the African media as well. So in making the Ukrainian authorities are making the steps forward towards to make more tight relationship with the countries in Africa. And first of all, for the first time since Ukraine regained its independence in 1991, high-ranking official, Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, just recently he was touring the African countries, trying to tackle the Russian propaganda and the Kremlin's narrative, and trying to make connection with the new countries in Africa. Also, under the UN-backed deal, when Russia withdraw for the short time from this grain deal, so Ukraine couldn't, all of us thinking that Ukraine couldn't export the grain, but Ukrainian authorities decide and made a really strong decision, despite all of the risks, despite all of the huge Russian fleet circulating in northern Black Sea, to continue to these grain corridors with the grain initiative to support people in Africa to deliver them a food. And also Ukrainian president said that Ukraine is going to donate and already donated several thousand, hundred thousand metric tons of the grain to the countries basically like Ethiopia, as well as President Zelensky appointed the special representative for the Africa and the Middle East, which is another step forward towards tackling the Russian narrative in among the African countries. And Ukraine is trying to address that the those countries who are voting against UN resolutions, for example, that are condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine and violating the human rights in Ukraine. Ukrainian officials are trying to convince them and to show them the credibility uh, that these countries should vote for those resolutions and condemn the Russian aggression. Of course, some of the Russian countries are keen on the Russian support, but the Russians are usually, and you know this in Central African Republic, in Mali, and other in Eritrea and other countries, they are supporting the dictators as well. They are sometimes supporting the opposite side, so making the situation more unstable on the ground. And they are trying as well to influence more countries and make them less stable. And in the meantime, Ukraine is trying for the African countries to make such deals that is going to be benefited for both sides, from the one African countries and from the for the Ukraine as well. And that's why Foreign Minister Kuleba was touring the Africa, and it's more visits are to be followed next year definitely. And we are awaiting some of the African leaders in Kyiv during this invasion. And I would like to hear your thoughts about, um, and especially from the representative from the African countries, how do you see the Ukrainian role in resolving this food crisis, and the Ukrainian role in the delivering the cheap and so essential grain to Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We would have loved to have Oleksandr with us, and we also wanted to have him taking part in this discussion, but also because of the connection and the blackouts in Kiev, and it's not evident to have him with us permanently. So this is a recorded video. Basically what he said goes back to an article that he recently wrote, "As Ukraine looks west, Russia wins over Africa." That's the title of the article, and that's how we got to contact Oleksandr Khrebet. With this, I would like to open the discussion, and I would like to ask, first of all, to Irina Schoulgin, how you look at the consequences of, on the one hand, COVID, and on the other hand, also this Russian aggression in Ukraine. How you look at these factors? To what extent is this really affecting the Africa-Europe partnership? Because sometimes we have the impression when we follow the debates in Brussels, I sometimes have the impression that it is a bit business as usual. And we talk about the global gateway, and we talk about the whole follow-up of the summit of February, but isn't there something more fundamental taking place? Isn't this crisis also showing us that there are maybe underlying tensions that are now much more coming to the forefront? Just a question to you, and then we ask the African representatives also to give their reactions, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pat. Thank you to all. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Very few familiar faces, since I'm not in the Brussels scene, but I'm sure that I will be filled in afterwards who you all are. But it's very nice to have this opportunity to be here and to discuss these issues. And it's quite clear, of course.
A little bit closer.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. It gives this echo, so that's why I was trying to avoid it. Anyway, well, as you yourself stated almost in the question, is that it's almost an impossible question to answer. This is extremely broad and quite complicated. And of course, I mean, I represent the Swedish Foreign Affairs, and we are, of course, also very keen to be part of a common EU policy and EU politics. But it's, when it comes to issues like this, it's not always that easy to make that one and the whole. So I think I will try to speak perhaps more from the Swedish perspective, and to a large extent that would obviously also coincide with the EU. But I think, I mean, one thing that strikes me when you ask this question is that I think that we have, as maybe as both as Sweden as EU, is that I think we have had challenges for quite some time to really have an honest dialogue with many of our African partners about what is really going on, what it is, what expectations we have on one another, and what developments is going on in the world. So many things have changed. And at least from where I sit, I feel that we haven't really been able to follow that. You know, we are a little bit outdated in the way that we relate to one another and in the subjects that we raise when we have our dialogues and so forth. And I think when we had the issue around COVID and now the war, it has become quite clear. And in some strange way, I think that maybe that is actually quite good. You know, we need to have these discussions, and we need to also be able to explain to our African partners where we come from, our starting points, and how we see things. Just as, of course, we also need to listen to the starting points and the views and the realities from our African partners. And I think what has happened in a way is that when the war on Ukraine, when it started, I think we felt almost surprised that we were not more united with our African friends. You know, that we thought that it was such a clear case, kind of, for us from our perspective, as it was for many of our European friends, just as for us, quite existential with having a very aggressive superpower in Russia. But also that we would sort of expected our African friends to really understand that context and sort of share that with us. And I think it was a little bit of a surprise when it wasn't such an overwhelming sort of, yes, we are with you, we hear you, we understand, kind of. And I think that's perhaps also why we missed, we got a little bit off on a bad footing in the beginning somehow. Not with everyone, but sort of overall, if one generalizes. And I hope, and I do think that we have adjusted that quite a bit recently. And I think we are in quite good way of sort of being a little bit more soul searching also. What have we done wrong? How should we have, maybe approached this dialogue with our African partners around these issues in a different way? And as always, when you have a dialogue, you need to listen also. And you need to also be prepared to hear what is being said. Listening is quite a difficult thing very often. Anyway, so I think somehow something good is still coming out of this. And I think that to share what expectations we have and what different starting points we have, we need to be more honest. And I think we are more honest today than we were maybe 2 years ago.
Thank you very much. Let's ask the ambassador of Senegal,
Now you have to agree.
Mr.
Yes.
Moctar Diop.
Yes.
Why was Africa or were Africa and Europe not more united? That's in fact the question that was raised. What was the reason for example, the abstention in the General Assembly in March of 17 African countries against the resolution that would condemn the Russian invasion in Ukraine?
Thank you very much, Ger. I wish I could agree with Madam, but my strong belief is that first of all, everything was set between Africa and EU to agree on the situation in Ukraine, because the aggression happened, I think, barely 1 week after the summit. And the summit was well prepared, well organized, and we were praising the new momentum between EU and AU. I was one of the eyewitnesses from Addis Ababa to Brussels. But I think there is a mistake. The first mistake is our European partners believe that African support was taken for granted. And I think we need to discuss on that before. Never take support for granted. There was a new situation and Africa did not have a common position on the situation, on the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. And you will remember that immediately after the outbreak of the war, the chair of the union, President Mikael from Senegal, and the chairperson of the commission, they issued a communique to condemn aggression against Ukraine. It was clear that for these two leaders, there was an aggressor and an aggressor. But the statement does not mean that this is a common position on Africa. And when, to answer directly to your question, Gert, when a draft resolution was put on the table at the UN General Assembly, African countries, they appreciated the situation based on the assessment they made themselves and their own national position. We cannot force them, to support or not to support. And even, to be frank, even the European Union, there was not a consensus on that. Not all the 27 EU member states are voting for the resolution. So we must accept that there is no common African position on that, and that African countries were free to vote for or against the regime, or most of them, they abstained because they wanted to understand the situation and to evaluate, to make their own assessment. This is the reason why African countries, about 44–45% abstained, including Senegal, and it was our national position. So we need to discuss, to agree on the principle, and to be frank enough and recognize that before the draft resolution was taken to the UN General Assembly, it was first examined at the UN Security Council on September 30th. And Russia vetoed that draft resolution. Nobody, raised any problem about that. And then it was moved to the General Assembly. After they say, counting those who vote for the resolution and those who abstain. You see, for me, the most important from the African perspective is the failing of the most relevant UN body to take this situation into account, to take in charge the situation. And you can feel about the different position expressed by African countries, a kind of frustration that, yes, for long ago, we have been campaigning to request your support to reform the UN Security Council. You did not want to support us. Now you need our support. This is how we react. This is my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Interesting perspective. Let's maybe ask our other colleague from Africa first, and then I go and come to the ambassador in Addis. Paul Simon Handy, you are publishing regularly commentaries and blogs and very interesting pieces, including on this one, on this particular issue, unpacking Africa's divided stance on the Ukraine war. A lack of principled consistency in solving conflicts makes Africa's non-aligned position looks like short-sighted opportunism. That's what I read in one of your papers. I don't know whether you remember this. But please, your views on the question raised. Why was it that this cohesion between European and African positions was not there at the moment that Russia invaded Ukraine?
Thank you very much, Rhea. And really, thanks to ECDPM for inviting me. Happy to be back in Brussels and to have these discussion. Ambassador Markussen and I have been discussing those topics at length in Addis and elsewhere, by the way. So I think, as the ambassador said, the EU had a common position on Ukraine, some exceptions, and some countries playing the individual games, but there was a common position of the European Union. There wasn't a common position of the African Union. And I'm a bit surprised that the fact that the African Union doesn't have a common position surprises people, actually, because that seems to be the norm. It's extremely difficult. It has been extremely difficult for the AU to develop common African positions on many issues. Yeah, and including on many wars. Thinking of Libya, actually, as well. There wasn't an African common position on Libya. There were actually stark differences on Libya, by the way, even though after some years now, what we hear is rewriting of the history, but there was never an African common position on that. It's not so new, but it says a lot, in my view, about both the African Union, but also about partners' expectations of the African Union. What does it say about the African Union? Among others, what it suggests is that the African Union is probably not the actor, the international policy actor that many external actors would like to see. The African Union is not particularly the Commission. It's not this supranational body that we all hope it is. It remains an extremely a strong intergovernmental body that struggles actually to, I mean, the Commission struggles to develop those common positions. And it will, you're still going to be surprised that it's difficult for the AU Commission to develop those. But partners also are struggling because, I mean, they're putting too many expectations on these body that struggles because there's a need, there seems to be a need internationally for a stronger AU. So the question we should be asking is to how do we actually support the AU to reach that level? And I think that's what many actors have been doing, partners, external partners. Not so sure about African governments, actually, because I'm not really sure if African governments at this stage want the AU to be a more supranational body, actually. I have my doubts about that, but maybe there are some governments, some member states that are more proactive, that will like an AU that abides by certain international principles, some expectations about international behavior. And there are some governments actually that remain into these anti-colonial rhetoric. And I also see this discrepancy, you know, from many African capitals, people see the European Union as a colonial body. Many don't actually make the analysis that the European Union is composed of member states whose majority are not former colonial powers. Actually, some have been colonized as well. So, which makes it extremely difficult for the EU to be kind of kept into in this image of a colonial body. So there's some sort of discrepancy that the war in Ukraine, and maybe before that, COVID had actually expressed in a way that Irina was mentioning, that today we are more honest when we are discussing. Partnerships are tested by such events. Maybe it's good that those things come out now, and it forms, in my view, a useful basis for a discussion among partners.
Thank you very much, Paul Simon. And I would like to ask the ambassador in Addis how this was perceived at your level in Addis. The fact that there's a number of negative feelings, apparently underlying tensions that were not necessarily outspoken and that now more and more come to the forefront. How do you look at that yourself from your experience?
Thank you very much, and warm welcome to all of you who've made it here physically. No, thanks a lot. 4 points from my side, and I guess I will be one of the bridge builders because being European, sitting in Addis. My first point is related to, we are talking about the COVID-19 and the Ukraine here, but I will make the point, if you sit in Africa, there are more crises. There are more crises. If you talk to African ambassadors, and I've been a colleague, so it's very nice to be here with Diop. There are especially 2 more issues and trends that we have to look at. One is there is actually an increase in the number of crises on the African continent. So when we talk about Ukraine, it's perceived as yes, but we feel that we've got, you know, maybe 15 others that are affecting our situation. And the other issue that we need to look at is the worry about the unconstitutional changes of government. So there are governance issues, and some of these, of course, related and put under pressure, related to what we're discussing tonight about the COVID-19 and about also the Russian war in Ukraine. So I think my first report, you said, how did I experience it? My first report, one of the first at least, I wrote back to Brussels, was called Vaccines, Vaccines, Vaccines. I arrived in September 2020, and it was really, you know, you were sitting in your house 2 weeks, you couldn't move anywhere, you didn't meet a lot of people. And I could see the geopolitics, obviously, of the vaccines. I think we've done well as the European Union. It was very difficult at the beginning, but now we have what I call a 360-degree approach to it. There is institutional cooperation. We are also starting manufacturing, support of manufacturing of vaccines. That's my first point. Second one is, I think we already also heard Camilla talking about some partnerships are more relevant than ever. And I do think that the EU-AU partnership is more relevant than ever, because you mentioned the summit that we had, but there are a lot of fundamental values that we share. And I think that's extremely important to bear in mind and to build on. And of course, we're just Monday out of the Commission to Commission meeting here in Brussels between the AU Commission that came here with most of the commissioners and of course the chairperson, and meeting the Commission President here von der Leyen and the EU commissioners. And there you will see, if you studied or if you haven't, have a look at the press release, the joint press release that really states what we are doing jointly and how we've followed up since the summit. And there you will see, of course, the global gateway is there, the big investments. We know that Chairperson Faki, when you talk to him, he says Africa needs connectivity. We need to work jointly on exactly the health issues. We need to work jointly also, and here, of course, we can't neglect the effects of both COVID and of the Ukraine war, because it has impacted economically in particular, I would say, and also in terms of food security and prices. They are skyrocketing. So I think we need each other, because there is a questioning. You were mentioning it, Diop. There's a questioning, fundamental discussion of the international order. And I'm sure many of you heard the Kenyan, especially ambassador, at the first discussion, 2nd of March, when the first vote was there, saying Africa actually took, where African leaders, but I can be corrected here between my colleagues, but what I see where we have something in common is the respect for the UN Charter and the sovereignty and the respect of borders. I think the Kenyan ambassador put it very elegantly, saying if Africa had not respected the borders agreed by foreign powers, it would have been you had seen even more crisis. So I think there's something fundamental. My third, which we can elaborate on, third point is what I call it takes two to tango, which means the strategic partnership we have between the EU and the AU, between Europe and Africa. I think we have been put under pressure with the COVID crisis, with the Ukraine in particular. What I'm seeing sitting in Addis, and we have all EU ambassadors have been asked to démarche a lot of times. So some of the issues mentioned by of course, Irina first, a surprise did not come as much as a surprise in Addis, I think, among ambassadors in Addis as perhaps in European capitals. We could see that it influenced the partnership. What I want to say, when I say it takes two to tango, is I also make the point to my African colleagues that Europe is also suffering. So this actually also takes some sympathy from the Africans to show us, and that's what we as Europeans are asking for as well. We have many discussions of situation in Somalia, in Mozambique, many Sahel. Let's also have an opportunity to discuss Ukraine without, and I think this is important, Ukraine should not be the only issue. It can be discussed, but it should not be the only issue, because as I said, if you talk to African leaders, there are more crises, there are unconstitutional change of government, there are other issues on the agendas in Africa. My last, and then I will stop here, is I think I want to build on some of the crises we're seeing, of course, showing us that the world is global and more interdependent than what we saw Previously, climate change, we just had Sharm el-Sheikh. There are, and Ukraine, of course, also shows us that the international security architecture and the international economy is interlinked. I want to say, just because I like the discussion, I think this is an opportunity for us to look at the multilateral order, and we need to get together to support it. I heard you in terms of saying, well, now because of the voting in New York, then some partners realize we need to reform. I think this is an opportunity. I think this is an opportunity for Africa to step in and to play the role that obviously 54 members of the UN should play in the world. I think I'll end there and look forward to the further discussions. Thanks a lot.
I see a reaction by the ambassador. Please feel free to ask the floor and react on each other's interventions. That's part of the discussion.
Yes, thank you. It's very interesting. I just want to correct one mistake. The first draft resolution Russia vetoed was presented on February 26. February 26, a few days after. So I have to correct this. And then to react on colonialism. Yes, I agree with Birgitte. The war in Ukraine have been seen from the African perspective as over-prioritized. And I have heard my president recently during the Dakar Peace and Security Forum saying that we are not against Ukraine, but we just want to draw the attention of our partners that while the European people are suffering, while the Ukrainian people is suffering, African people also are suffering from terrorism. African peoples are suffering from various, threats. So we need a kind of balance to take in charge all the security situation that deserves the full attention of the international community. Now, coming to colonialism, you see, when I listened to President Zelensky's statement to AU, all the statements have been, articulated around fighting colonialism. I think it was obvious from his mind, from his perspective, that if you want to mobilize support from Africa, you have to talk about colonialism because they are very sensitive on that. But the resolution that has been, adopted after did not show there was any change in the attitude of the African UN members. Look, the resolution that was adopted on October 12 received 143 votes in favor, a bit more than the others. The average was 141, and less abstention, 35. The last one that was adopted on November 14, this month, calling for Russia to pay war reparation to Ukraine, received 94 votes in favor and 73 abstention. This means that most of the time they feel that the draft resolution are politically motivated. And when it is like this, African member states and others from different regions, they prefer to abstain because they don't understand, the message from the Western world. The last point is perception. Very, very important. Perception. The war is happening between Russia and Ukraine, but we don't see Ukraine on the front line. We see EU and the United States. all the draft resolution are presented either by EU or the United States, never Ukraine.
Yes, but let me say something there. At a certain moment, Ukraine also wanted to get into a dialogue with the African Union.
Yes.
And there was very few African heads of state who were interested in this direct dialogue.
Yes, yes, yeah. I agree. Yes, I agree. Because I was following the case. The problem is, I think it was not well organized. For me, it was not well organized because at first it was only the bureau, and then at the last minute they decide to convene all members. So it was not, well organized from my understanding. Anyway, I think when you see EU and the United States on the front line, it gives us, the perception of this is, a new Cold War. And NATO on the other side. So it's a little bit confusing for African member states. I think this is also an idea that can be, taken into account to better understand African member states' attitude. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Irina, Schoulgin.
Yeah, thank you. Just very shortly, just to react to what Ambassador Diop said, I think that the issue around the disappointment that I mentioned, it's not really, that we are taking the African continent for granted. I don't think I think that when I saw the vote, I was actually positively surprised on the first vote, because I think we do understand that it is very often difficult for many African countries to, having all this pressure from the superpowers and try to balance it. And it's sort of easier to somehow step out and say, let me not get involved in this. But it does come back to what both you and Birgitte was mentioning, the issue about the UN Security Council, the issue that you have a permanent member who's, the first paragraph in the charter is supposed to, uphold peace and security. And this is a member who actually invades another country. It is different. And I think that we can, as the EU, also say that we do engage quite a lot in many crises in Africa. We do try, maybe we are not being very successful, but we do try to engage in supporting the fight against terrorism and be there for different crises and try to support and find different ways, whether we succeed or not. But I think that honestly, we can say that we do. But this is something that happens to us. This is on our continent. And I don't think that it is strange that we then go to our African partners and say, now we need you to support us. So I think that is what I meant when I said that there was a bit of I don't know, disappointment or surprise, that this is such a fundamental issue that we have defended together with, Sweden and, against colonialism, all of these things. And then all of a sudden it becomes a superpower game that we don't want to be part of. We have superpower games going on all the time in the UN, in the council, all the time. But this one, it was still a little bit different. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we completed this first round. A few pointers that struck my attention. I think there's a clear expression of shared values and interests that at least on paper exist. And I think nobody disagrees on that. And it was mentioned by the ambassador in Addis. But if you then look at the reality, the real life, then you see a lot of irritants on both sides. You see a lot of disappointments in the partnership, double standards, incoherences, politically motivated resolutions, perceptions on a new Cold War. Also the type of criticism in Africa that we should also take seriously, and that was not only mentioned by the African participants around this table, but also by the ambassador in Addis, that we should broaden the perspective on the crisis context in Africa. Africa has many more crises to deal with than these two ones that we have selected here. But the positive thing, what I retain from this first round and from the discussions, the points that were raised by all of you, is that we are having a much more honest dialogue at this moment, a much more open dialogue on these issues. We are not hiding these anymore. We try to resolve it. And this brings me to our next round. If we know that we have diverging expectations in both groups of countries, and you can never say that Africa is monolithic or Europe is monolithic. There's a lot of difference and divergence amongst the various countries in both continents. But the question that I would have is, can we use this crisis, these crises, to build a new type of partnership? What are the opportunities? How can we better manage the diverging expectations that definitely are there, but that should be managed in a way that is more open and that is probably leading to a better common understanding of the various points? And let me start maybe this time with the ambassador in Addis, and then we go to our other colleagues around the table.
Thank you very much. I like talking about solutions and looking into what we can do, because that's really the approach we have taken among ambassadors, European and African ambassadors in Addis Ababa. So I've got 3 suggestions for what I think we should look at. I hinted to it before. I think this is an opportunity for Africa to play a larger role in the multilateral order on the world stage. It of course comes with, I think my Paul Simon said it. I mean, that would take that there are certain reforms actually taking place within the African Union and some of the African decision-making bodies, because it's at the moment taking decisions on issues outside of Africa. For the AU-PSC, that's not within its mandate. And that's why we have not been able, and the AU-PSC is not able to take a decision and help taking a decision on a situation like Ukraine. So it would take, if Africa could get a seat at the G20, which has been discussed many times, your president has also mentioned it, that would also take some, but I think it would take some reflections and reforms on the African side, but I think there is a momentum. That's my point. There is an opportunity to step in that we as the European Union strongly support. My second point is that I think it's been very good to see and interesting, important to see African organizations taking leadership on issues. If you look at the Africa CDC, really, I saw in Kenkazong, the director at that time of Africa CDC, he was always invited to African Union leaders meeting to advise on this, and they actually developed continental strategies. Also, in terms of food security, we can see there are also initiatives taken, which I think is really important. AFCFTA is another one. So I think there are really issues here that we should look into and support further. We're already working on this together. My last one again was just to emphasize the issue of playing a stronger role in the multilateral order that I think we need to support. We need to strengthen it because it's under pressure. We've seen how Lavrov, the Russian minister, was also in Africa. He also visited Addis Ababa in July, and he had discussions with the African ambassadors, offering an alternative, to be honest, to the UN system. And from what I'm picking up, that was not necessarily taken so positively, because that's really a big step to take. So I think we have something to protect together, and I think we should really work on that. Those were my 3 first quick bits. Thanks.
Thank you for these constructive proposals. Paul Simon, a question for you. What are the windows of opportunities for a strengthened Africa-Europe partnership resulting from this crisis context?
I think there are many, and I think these. I'm a bit surprised to see actually also how to see perceptions of a Russian takeover of African. I'm really very surprised. Yeah. So the reality suggests something completely different. Yeah. So what is Russia taking over actually? Russia is making a lot of noise. Yeah. Some countries have fallen into the security charm of Russia, but not much more than that. I don't think Russia is a real alternative, and African countries understand that. It's not. Russia doesn't even really seriously pretend to be an alternative beyond the geopolitical game. I think there are many entry points, and I really think the first point that Birgitte just made on the AU playing, or African countries playing, a larger role in the multilateral system, that also goes beyond just African matters. Yeah, the multilateral system does not just consist in African crisis. So there needs to be an African or African voices on global matters as well. And I think the capacity of the African Union to develop those voices, even being divergent, it's not there yet. There needs to be much more work internally in terms of structure, but also conceptually in developing the AU into a real international actor that can actually maybe sit in the G20 and the G20 and have a view on crises that go beyond just the borders of the African continent. But in talking about the multilateral system and entry point of reforming it, I think the most important thing will also be to agree on what is wrong with this system as well, because for many, I mean, I'm not speaking for African countries, yeah, so I'm an analyst. I happen to be African, but I'm analyzing from a global perspective. But many representative of African countries also consider that these multilateral system has been problematic for decades. Maybe agreeing on what is wrong or what doesn't work. For some African countries, the Cold War has actually been quite warm, actually. So it has been a serious series of wars in Africa, not in Europe, not in the US, but in the rest of the world. So that war wasn't so cold. So maybe we have an opportunity now, particularly also related to issues, to climate security issues. I think we have an opportunity now to rebuild, now that we are moving towards a new type of economy, fossil free type of economy. I think we have an opportunity, a difficult one actually, to go back to the drawing board and develop new ways of trading together. That is slightly new ways that are different from maybe what we have now. Perceptions matter, and African perceptions of the economic or the trade, international trade architectures, that this is a system that hasn't favored critical African development issues, particularly industrialization. So we have to look at those. I think there's some sort of agreement about what should be done. But of course, it's also politically and economically difficult to embrace the necessary solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ambassador, what are for you the key priorities to change the partnership, Europe-Africa partnership in this context? What are the opportunities now to change it? What should be done from your perspective, your experiences?
Thank you. For me, three main points. The first one is to continue dialogue, to enhance dialogue between our two continents. We are discussing, I think, to just mention a few, my president in his capacity of AU chair participated to the extraordinary meeting of the European Council on May 31st. President Charles Michel participated to the mid-year coordinator. Yes. Yeah. And then most recently in New York, in the margin of the UNGA, Leaders Summit on Global Food Security take place in New York. And Prime Minister from Spain, Charles Michel, and many world leaders, participated to that program. So we need to continue dialogue. I think the more we discuss, the more we exchange, the more we have, chance to understand each other and to avoid some misunderstanding or crisis, and to take full advantage from the lessons learned from the way we manage, the COVID crisis. Because at first we received many donations from European Union through COVAX facility, and now with financial support and technical support of European Union, we are developing our own, pharmaceutical capacity. And Senegal, for example, is developing Madiba and will be able in very few months to produce some vaccines, not only against COVID, but also against some other diseases happening in Africa. This is a good, example, and we can build on this positive experience. So first, enhance dialogue on food security, on any other, priority between our two continents. The second is, I think after almost 1 year of war, I think it's a time now to have serious peace talk. Cannot continue like this. Yesterday, I was participating to the joint EU OECPS, ministerial meeting, and I heard from the European side that there is no sincere discussion from Russia. Okay, but let us, bring about sincere discussion. Because if we continue taking some sanctions, putting political pressure, etc., I think it will be very hard, to set the condition for serious peace talks. I think it's time for, serious discussion for peace. And since so far, the only multilateral body that succeed to reach something is the UN. For example, under the UN Black Sea Grain Initiative, it can take place under the auspices of the UN. I think the UN is fully mandated, fully prepared to conduct peace talks in order to solve the solution. And my last point is, to be frank, as an African, I think it's a time also for African states to take their own responsibility. We cannot continue to ask from our partners to lay the foundation for better multilateralism, for an open, fairer multilateralism system. That's good, but we have also to assume our responsibility as sovereign states to strengthen our institutions, to lay the foundation for, stable and well-organized states, so as to lower our dependency on foreign on foreign powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very useful, interesting points. And I would like to ask Irina Schoulgin to conclude this round, because then we go to the audience. And please start thinking of your questions, because we will go a little bit over time. We started a bit late, so there's still time for questions and answers. But you have the last word in this round.
It makes it easier for me because you have all said so many wise things. It was 4 points and then there were 3 points, so maybe then I have only 2 points. But I think I can be very quick because I do agree to a lot what was said. And I think that really maybe the first point is really the same as Ambassador Diop, that we need to continue the dialogue and we need to continue on both sides to keep that up. And I think it takes time to change. We have really old patterns and sort of old relationship patterns that are quite stuck, and it takes a bit of time to change that. But I think we are on a good way of doing that, and I think especially as you were saying that partnership has to be based on something else than the sort of old donor recipient or old ideas around colonialism or whatever it is. We now need to be brave enough to see that is much more to our partnership than that. And there is so much that we need to do together to be able to move forward. So my second point would really be that we have also touched upon on the multilateral. I think maybe the whole issue around the climate and security, or the whole issue around the debate about what do we need to do to address the climate. I think it's something where the Europe and the Africans really should work even closer together. And I think this is something where we all see that the superpowers here needs to step up, all of them, and a few more big countries as well, actually, in the world, to really do their share. And I think we together can put that pressure on them also to do that. And together we have a lot of votes in the UN. So I hope that that could be something forward-looking that could be positive. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these constructive ideas and proposals. So the floor is now open, and I would also like to invite the people in the chat to react. We have our colleagues, Daniele, Maria, and others who are following what is being asked and also said in the chat. Don't limit yourself to just questions. Make also your own points, observations, but please be brief. And if you have questions, make it very clear to whom your question is addressed, because we will ask the panelists at the end, in the last 2 minutes, each of them will have 2 minutes to react on what is being said. So the floor is open. I see a rise of hands. In front of me, Sébastien Treyer. We take a few questions together. Please, Sébastien.
Thank you very much. And it's really thank you very much for all your comments.
Yes, make yourself known. I said it already, but maybe which institute you're representing as well.
Thank you, Gert. I'm Sébastien Treyer. I'm the director of IDRI, Institute for Sustainable Development International Relations in Paris. And I wanted to maybe ask you also if you thought that the dialogue on energy security has improved, because I see that there was a lot of mentions by the President of the African Union and also as the President of Senegal, that there was a lot of hypocrisy concerning fossil fuel and the gas diplomacy of the EU and the way that the EU was investing in Africa. I have the impression that COP27 was an occasion for very honest discussions, closed doors, but I heard that they happened. And I hope that we can have a much better clarity on trying not to put African countries back into providers of raw materials for Europe, and at the same time being able to see how not to lock in the African countries into investments in fossil fuel that might not be the investments of the future, and understanding at the same time that there are needs for getting money, and that selling gas is a way to get money. I think that was made clear. I wanted to get, so it's, of course, it might be a question that is directly asked to Ambassador Diop, but I would be really happy to see also if Ambassador Markussen can say a word about that, because I think this is a very contentious issue that is both on the needs of Europe and the needs of Africa, while food security is really about the needs of Africa, and then we see what can be done.
Thank you, Sébastien. So this is a first observation and also question. I see San Bilal, please, yeah, please, San, and then we go to the other side of the room.
Thank you very much. San Bilal from the European Center for Development Policy Management. I'm a bit surprised that, I mean, you said a lot of nice words, but we are in a really situation globally. Let's forget about Europe, Africa, but just globally, where you have multiple crises. And honestly, my question to you is, how do we respond, or how Europe and Africa can try to find common responses to these crises that we are seeing? I mean, the COVID-19, we've known that in Africa, they have not, I mean, they have been hardly affected, I mean, they have been heavily affected, and this is going to lead probably to some debt crisis and a lot of problems in Africa, food crisis, energy crisis, and so on. Also in Europe. The same for the war in Ukraine, when we see a lot of the problems. And I'm surprised to hear these elements that, oh, we have wars in Africa and we suffer, we have many crises, and now for once you have one in Europe, you know, poor you. But it is a global crisis. So the war in Ukraine is not just Russia, Ukraine, is not just affecting Europe, it is affecting the rest of the planet, and in a systemic way. And so one would expect that Europe and Africa, if you're so close, or if you want to have a real partnership, you try to come with some common solutions. And I don't see them, to be honest. It's the same discussion that we could have had in February at the summit. My last point, and that's directly question to Birgitte. I'm surprised that, you know, Ambassador Diop says basically Europe should stop sanctions on Russia and just go to a negotiating table, which seems to be an absolute red line for the EU. So how do you address that?
Thank you, San. Quite some provocative questions. Let's go to the other side of the room. Daniele.
Thank you very much for this excellent panel. Frank Matthijs, United Nations University. As the Deputy GD highlighted, it's a principled and even fundamental or existential matter for many European countries, what's happening in Ukraine, and therefore there are more and more voices that say, well, it should affect also development aid distribution. Now, Sweden and the EU have been at the forefront of financially supporting the EU. Do you see that these voices will be accommodated in the future in terms of the amount of aid or the type of aid that should be provided? And conversely, maybe for the African perspective, do you anticipate a change of financial support coming from Europe to Africa, or is this something that you already see happening? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just looking around whether anyone is, I see Rok Kozelj.
Good evening to everyone. Rok Kozelj from Africa One, European External Action Service. My question was about the strengthening of the dialogue that you all mentioned. I also believe it is extremely important to reinforce dialogue between Africa and Europe and to continue to do so. And my question would be to whomever wishes to answer how you see in this context of strengthening of the dialogue also the role of non-state actors, such as civil society and youth. How do you believe they could contribute actively to this strengthening? Thank you.
Thank you. We can take a fifth one. I see Mariella, and there's even more. I think we take all the questions and also observations. You don't have to always put questions. You can also make a point from your own perspective and react on what has been said in the panel. Please, Mariella.
Mariella Licciommo, ECDPM, so part of the think tank of the ETTG group as well. My question was a bit like, I was also a bit surprised about all the positive comments, and I think we discussed a lot around multilateralism. However, if you read some of the commentaries around the partnership, some of them are very critical. And I don't know, the other day was in a discussion and someone was wondering, okay, what are we going to do for the partnership going forward? What's the value of having a partnership at all in some way? My question to you is therefore, where do you see the areas in which the partnership has actually brought to results or has space to bring results in the future? In my mind, there are some things that are actually quite positive, although they are not necessarily directly linked. All the discussion around vaccine may be one. I think a few years ago, we were not talking about industrial production of vaccines in Africa. The climate discussions and the loss and damage fund, although with all the limitations that we know in terms of who is going to pay, is another element, but maybe you have others, and I would like to listen your ideas about that. Thanks.
Thank you. See one more. Daniele will be in good condition, no?
Hi, my name is Brandon from the One Campaign. I have an observation and then a question. And the observation is, I think during COVID, we saw, and we discussed a little bit of this, how difficult it was for the EU to make some really difficult decisions with regards to putting global interests sort of before national interests. And that wasn't just the EU, that was pretty much every country. It was me first, my people first, we need to get vaccinated first, et cetera. And that sort of reflects a little bit, I think, how other policies also are created across the multilateral system, which is a problem. And I think the second problem we saw was just the difficulty of really confronting a very strong hold of private industry interests over global health objectives. And that just comes down to the policy coherence of internal policies, internal trade, competition, research policies with external policies, which is very difficult. And I think what we saw was that the EU did a lot of fantastic things, and it did what it's good at. It donated vaccines. We saw a lot of money mobilized to important efforts. And I think part of the problem is articulating, like you were saying, what is that extra thing that we needed to see, or what is that extra mile that wasn't crossed that really would have tackled a more systemic issue. And I think that the vaccine is a great example of maybe where things could have gone better. And now my question is, are we maybe making some of these same mistakes when we look at food security and climate issues? Because I think a lot of those same problems around putting more pressure on the private sector, putting global interest before national interest, aligning domestic and foreign policy, it is we see a lot of patterns with regards, for example, when it comes to agriculture policy. Are we, is the EU putting our very competitive, very strong, probably the most advanced agriculture industry in the world, are we leveraging that for global interest? Are we making some of the potential sacrifices we need to see in our private sector for the global interest or for Africa's interest? And there's a lot, I think, when it comes down to the specifics of, are we actually investing in, agroecology, or are we supporting big agrochemical companies that are going to be producing more fertilizers? There's a lot of questions of, are we asking ourselves difficult questions, and are we actually putting forward sustainable solutions that sort of work externally and not just for our internal market? So I think that it's just a question of, the EU is doing a lot of fantastic things, even on food security, but it's just, are we going that extra mile, and are we articulating that problem of addressing the root cause of what's the issue rather than sort of tackling more the symptoms?
Thank you very much. I think many of these questions are extremely pertinent, and they would lead us into a new debate until midnight or even longer. But that's not a problem. I mean, it's a problem for tonight, but definitely for tomorrow, we have also a lot of inspiration already. And as you know, we will continue the discussions and go into much more detail, particularly on issues that you just raised, food security, energy, climate change, the financing, the question that was put also by some of the people here in the audience. That is absolutely for tomorrow. Also the peace and security, unconstitutional changes of governance, authoritarian rule, all the elements that have been mentioned here in this meeting room will be fleshed out tomorrow. And I would also like to invite all of you to read the 4 papers that we have sent electronically to you. We didn't want to copy them and put them on big piles. That's not sustainable anymore. But I hope that you will have some time this evening to read some of these papers that have been put together collectively by the 6 member institutes of ETTG. So it was really a collective job, and many of the issues raised will also be answered there. But with this, I would of course like to turn to this panel for their final 2 minutes. And I would maybe start with Ambassador Moctar Diop, because there's a few questions that were raised, and maybe the question also that, for example, our colleague Sam raised is quite a fundamental one. You cannot just say this is Europe's war. No, this is a situation which really affects the whole world at this moment, just as COVID was affecting the whole world, and particularly Africa, the most vulnerable countries. So this was one of the elements, but also feel free to react on the other elements. I think the point, where is civil society, non-state actors in all this, is also an element that could be raised. And there's more questions that have been mentioned, including the ones by Sébastien, to avoid that we would not break with old practices, and that Africa would really move away from the provider of raw materials, that it seizes the opportunities. So plenty of questions. I give you your 2 minutes and then we go to the rest of the table.
Thank you very much. So let me use my 2 minutes to go very quickly, trying to answer some few questions. Yes, I do agree that this is not only European war. No, it's a global crisis, and we are concerned by the situation in Ukraine. Maybe I did not express myself properly. That's why you got that impression, but it's not what I wanted to say. I discovered recently that Senegal is dependent about 28% from grain import from Ukraine. I did not know that, but this is official, official figures I can share with you. So with this, I cannot say that, no, it's not our business. So we are in. I just put on the table some proposals saying that if we continue taking only sanctions, putting pressure, political pressure on one side, maybe we will fail to, to open way for a diplomatic solution. Well, we know this war is, taking time. It's almost 1 year. At some point, it has to stop because people are dying. Public and private properties are being damaged. We have to stop it.
Would you react the same if Senegal was attacked?
Yes.
You would also say
yeah. Yeah. We have to stop and discuss. What do you want? We want lasting peace, or we want to continue to fight? We can choose to continue to fight and to risk, seeing our people dying, our private and public properties being damaged. Until when? I think we need to be realistic. It's not a matter of, nationalism, Senegal, or I'm also a diplomat, so we need to discuss. We know that when we need to discuss. Yes, we need to discuss and to see how to settle the problem. This is what I wanted to say. On, dialogue, on energy security after COP27. I think we all know that COP27, happened in the midst of a global energy crisis. So the fight of my president, I think that lasts more than 1 year, saying that we need to use our resources to develop our countries. Because what happened during the last COP was that a decision was taken to stop financing investment on electricity, on energy, on even gas, for example, saying that because gas is a fossil energy. And before, when European countries went back to coal, it's a crisis. Everybody is using its own resources to meet the needs of his population. So everybody was realistic enough, and there was no decision, saying that no more investment on fossil energy. We need to use our resources, gas, oil, to get access to universal access to electricity first. My president has been saying that at least 600 million of Africans don't have access to electricity out of a population of 1,300,000,000. So they need to have electricity. Even in my own country, some of my parents don't have this. And then we are the least industrialized continent. We need also to use these resources to develop ourselves. And it's also a matter of justice and equity. We are the continent that is polluting the least. So while others have used all fossil energy to develop themselves, we cannot accept to be, to be hindered in our project to develop our own country. So this is what my president has been campaigning for, and no decision at all has been taken after COVID, after COP27, not allowing, financing investment on access to energy and industrialization. I think this matter is now closed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can we go to the other ambassador around this table? Ambassador Markussen, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for very good reflections and questions. I do think that we respond to the situation. If there is an impression that we don't, we definitely do. And just to I tried in my introduction to say that this is one of the issues. My perspective was just to go broader and say there are other agendas when you sit in Africa. But what I want to respond to the issue. If you go just this Monday, von der Leyen and the chairperson of the African Union Commission agreed to first of all, to establish a new task force on fertilizers, because that's to improve the food production in Africa. This is really key. We have also, as European Union, just in terms of food security, we have stepped up. By 2024, we will. There are funds available of up to 4.5 billion euro. This goes for across Africa. But I think it has to be seen together with the initiatives also taken by the African Development Bank that we're also working with for the food security. Actually, in Africa, when you sit there, and I know there are also criticism, of course, of ensuring that the food production in Africa is wider. And that there's more self-sufficient. I was reading somewhere that 60% of our land that is not produced is actually in Africa. So there's a lot of potential, and that's why. So we are very focused on that. On energy, yes, I think what the ambition is also. I've just been hearing it. Maybe you're listening to von der Leyen. The ambition is really of course, there is, if you listen to von der Leyen on one side, we can use this situation to leapfrog into some greener solutions. Of course, Faki will then say we need transition, because we need access to other types of energy as well. So that's the type of discussions that are ongoing. We worked a lot with the African Union to develop continental energy markets and so on and so forth. But of course, it's an important, very, very important issue you're mentioning. So I think I also know that an old colleague from the European Investment Bank is here, and I want to say on the issue of that's another crisis response. I think it is to work also with the banks and the financial sector to create the financial space. And we worked a lot on the special drawing rights and other ways to increase also access for African countries. The last thing you mentioned on climate change, where I think it's worthwhile. Absolutely, I think there is. We know as the European Union that Africa has contributed the least to the situation we are in now, and that's also why I think it was very positive, obviously, to see Timmermans coming out, the chief negotiator on the EU side, and say we support this fund for loss and damage. The main point here, and there we need to work with our African and other partners, is if you look at the G77 group, there are members of that group that wants access to this loss and damage that are not development countries, we would say, or not, are also big polluters. And I think you know which countries I'm adhering to. So there are issues there, but I just want to underline that the European Union were actually joining up, like we did in Paris and other situations with African partners on this issue. Many areas, but my one-liner here is really we are trying to respond to the situation the best we can, and I can assure you that us here at the table since 24th of February, it's just been another very important part of our jobs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Birgitte. Paul Simon, please, your reactions on the various questions that were raised and observations.
Quite interesting points, actually. I'd like to start maybe with a few remarks on the first question, the energy security one, and whether the dialogue is improving. I mean, the dialogue is going on, and I think that's good, but I still see a lot of egoisms, a lot of narcissism, actually. Leapfrogging or transitioning, I don't think is going to be an either or, going to be at the same time, actually. How do you convince Senegal, actually, not to use its gas and oil now when it needs it? I think it's going to be, and I think that the discussion also shouldn't be only based on moral arguments that sound completely shallow, and that will only pave the way for, I mean, we've talked a lot about Russia, but actually I think the big guy here is China, and that will just pave the way for Chinese investment in those areas. So I think the discussion has to go on, but it's going to be difficult. It's going to be transition will probably take longer than we might want it to take. And of course, I have to get the question on what role civil society can play. I think an important role. Civil society is already playing an important role, and of course, the digital space also offers a platform where actually, whether or not we allow the civil society to play that role, they will play that role. They will have a voice. So, but it needs, of course, to be channeled towards getting some constructive proposals on the table. there was a question on the financial support by the gentleman there, whether there's some apprehension in Africa about financial support being redirected, rechanneled from Europe to financial support from Europe to Africa being rechanneled. I mean, this is something that is being discussed, and I think also that the EU should take political positions also. I mean, support should not be for free, actually. So it's a market out there, and I think that this leads me actually to a question about alliances. Actually, alliances today are different from what they used to be. I mean, today what we see is some tendency towards short-term type of alliances, transactional, more transactional than actually value-based. And I think that in a way, European support should not be for free. Like any support is not for free, actually. So in my view, I think African partners know very well that the tensions resulting from the war in Ukraine might have political consequences or economic consequences as well. So, and then the very interesting question about the extra mile, about what we should do to address more just than the symptoms of the virus crisis. I think that's quite key. We're certainly not going to exhaust this tonight, but that's excellent food for thought, I think, for not just the discussions tomorrow, but beyond that. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul Simon. Yes, quick reaction.
There was just one very, very important point I wanted to touch upon as a response. The war in Ukraine has to stop, and I just want to say that's definitely a very important point made by my colleague, and I think that's a good message coming from our African partners, also to the parties in the conflict. I'm not sure that you pointed to the UN. That's definitely a player. Let's see what role the European Union here. I know the European Union, of course, also looking at the Ukraine position. But I do want to say, and I know that European leaders have been traveling to both places, actually, to also before the war started. But I just want to say, I think we fully agree, and I wanted to say that as a response as well. Thank you.
Thank you for this additional observation, very important. Irina Schoulgin, we started with you, I think, and you also have the last word as host of this meeting, please.
Oh, thanks a lot. But thank you. That's a tough one. I'm trying to think if there are some questions and comments that we didn't respond to. There was one, I think you asked about now the support that is given to Ukraine. Is that going to now influence how much support can also be given to other parts of the world? Was that...
More the principled method, so not necessarily because there's less money, but just because...
Yeah. I mean, of course, and I think it goes back to, yes, this war has to end, because it is horrible with all the people that are losing their lives and all these crises and all the money and resources that is going to be, I mean, that is put in and that is going to continue to have to be put in. So I think that goes for any war or crisis, that yes, of course, a lot of resources are being channeled to Ukraine now, and it will be also going forward. And I think that is a fact. But that doesn't mean that we cannot do two things at the same time or several things at the same time. And I think it's important to say that it doesn't mean that we then are focusing only on that and then the rest will, solve itself. That's not where we are. We are going to continue being very much looking into what we can do to also help in other situations and be there to support. But I do believe that maybe it sounds like we're sitting here saying, oh, it's nice, we're all going to talk and we have a dialogue now and we're going to, but I mean, the fact is that we had so much on our plate already before Ukraine. That are, of course, issues that we still have to work on. And I do think we come back to the climate a lot, but I think it is really something where we need to make use of the trust that we are hopefully now working on rebuilding or building. Because if we don't have that trust, I think that fund that we have now agreed to in Sharm el-Sheikh, it's never going to see the light of day if we don't trust each other enough to make that happen and to make sure that it actually goes to what it's supposed to go to and doesn't become all a political negotiation in New York for several years, which is of course a risk. So, and that is again comes back to the trust issue. So yes, these dialogues and these discussions are important, because if we cannot build this trust, we will not be able to together work to solve the issues that we really need to solve. So I think it can't be underestimated how important that is. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. San, very quick.
Sorry, just a clarification from both the ambassador of the EU in Addis and for the Swedish presidency. Are you saying that Zelensky should start peace negotiations with Russia when it is bombed by Russia, and that Europe should perhaps stop sanctions on Russia to try to have a settlement and agree that part of Ukraine should be captured by part of Ukraine territory should remain in Russia? Because you both said, or at least Ambassador, you implicitly said that you agree with Ambassador Diop that negotiations should take place and that both sides should stop the fight. So I'm just asking for clarification, because this seems to be a very different position than what the EU leaders are taking.
I fully understand that this is a very important question, but this leads us into a new debate, and a very, very quick reaction for those who want, please. But we can continue that discussion over the reception, I propose, but quick reaction.
What I said, just to be clear, is that, and this is also what our leaders are saying, I mentioned very clearly that this has to be something that is discussed with Ukraine. I mean, it is not, this is a very important issue. I think everybody can agree that the war has to stop. There is one aggressor. I think that's very important. So that's where, as far as I can go at the moment.
Yes, but obviously there is one aggressor. So if you can end this war, the aggressor has to withdraw. So that is, I mean, I think that is obviously our position. But how do you make that happen? Yeah, how do you make that happen? And I think that is what, you know, somehow we need to come to some sort of solution to that, and we don't have it. But I mean, just to say that you need to have talks or you need to find a solution doesn't mean that Ukraine is going to give up its territory. That's not our position at all.
This brings me to the end of this meeting, and it helps to draw a few conclusions, San. Thank you very much for that last question. Let me try to draw a few conclusions from this meeting. The first one that I definitely pick up from this discussion is the demand for more open dialogue and more honest open interaction between the different parties. And what I found very encouraging in this discussion was that this is not a kind of blame game. I've had times that there was the blame game. And maybe in official meetings, there's still this type of blame game. But I felt that there was a lot of openness around this table. And just recall what the ambassador has said. African countries should assume their responsibilities. If they really want to play a key role in the international scene, they should make sure that their institutions are stronger, that they really assume their responsibilities. On the European side, I also have seen that there is definitely recognition for elements in the strategic orientations that were not always working very well. And so I feel that this is an element that is definitely improving. This is definitely positive. But then we should also accept that we do not need to agree on everything. And sometimes I have the impression that the European Union wanted to make Africa the way we want Africa to be. And this is always a bit what has happened when we had dialogue on value agendas, when we had dialogue on a whole range of issues. Of course, there is convergence between both groups of countries on the broad policy priorities. But once you go a little bit deeper and you want to spell out the pathways to get to your final goals, then you see that there's major differences arising between both continents. And the call for peace is a typical example. Of course, everyone wants peace, but the way to get there might be very different between the different perceptions in the various continents. And also within the continents, there are different perceptions, of course, amongst the types of actors with whom you are talking, with whom you are interacting. So what I conclude there is that we need to learn to manage diverging expectations, diverging interest agendas. And this is a matter of negotiation. So we need to learn to negotiate amongst equal partners with due respect for each other's expectations and interest agendas. And if this can work, then I think we are going to make progress. So with this, I would like to thank this panel for the openness, for the very nice discussions, and of course also the audience for participating in this discussion. We now have a reception, so we can continue the debate for those who are willing to stay on for another 1 hour, 1.5 hours. Thanks a lot.